The knock at her door came at 6:30, and Cora Thatcher stood frozen in the middle of her small cabin with her hair half-pinned, and her heart cracking down the middle like sun-dried clay. She already knew what the evening was supposed to look like. She had known for 3 weeks, ever since Holt Mercer had pressed his hat to his chest in the general store and told her, with that slow, oil-slick smile of his, that he would be honored to escort her to the Millfield Town dance on the 23rd of August, 1883. She had said yes because she was 26 years old and this was a small town and people talked, and because she had been alone for 2 years since her father's passing, and the loneliness had its own particular weight that pressed on her lungs every morning when she woke. But now it was the 23rd of August, 1883, and the note had arrived at noon. She had read it 4 times. She could have read it 40 more and the words would not have changed. Miss Thatcher, I find I am otherwise engaged this evening. Do not wait on me. H. Mercer, that was all. No explanation. No apology that carried any real sincerity. Just 11 words and a dash and a name, delivered by a boy on a horse who had already disappeared down the red dust road before she could say a single word. She had sat down on the edge of her bed and pressed the note flat against her knee and stared at the knotted pine floor until the shapes in the wood grain started to blur. She was not crying. She refused to cry over Holt Mercer. What she was doing was something closer to reckoning, that slow, terrible math a woman does when she adds up all the small humiliations and realizes the sum is larger than she thought. Because this was not just about tonight. This was about the whispers she had heard 2 days ago at the dry goods store, that Holt Mercer had been seen riding out to the Calloway ranch with something urgent on his face, and that Clara Calloway, who was 22 and had a father with 400 acres, had been seen blushing at the mention of his name. This was about hidden motives she had been too willing to ignore. This was about the fact that Holt Mercer had been courting her while he positioned himself closer to Clara Calloway's inheritance, and Cora had been too proud and too lonely to see what was right in front of her. She had dressed for the dance anyway, not for Holt Mercer, for herself. She had put on the dark blue dress with the white eyelet collar that she had ordered from a catalog out of St. Louis and waited 6 weeks to receive. She had pressed it with the flat iron and hung it in the doorway the night before so the wrinkles would fall out. She had pinned her dark hair up and left 2 soft pieces loose at her temples the way she had seen in a fashion plate once, and she had looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and thought, just for a moment, that she looked like a woman who deserved a good evening. And then the note had come. And now she was standing in her half-pinned hair with the note still in her hand, and the lamp burning low on the table when the knock came at her door. Firm, unhurried, 3 distinct raps that did not sound like apology and did not sound like cruelty. They sounded like something else entirely, like purpose. She crossed the room and opened the door. Clark Dalton stood on her porch. She had seen Clark Dalton precisely 14 times in the 2 years she had lived in Millfield, Texas. She had counted, not because she was keeping score, but because he was the kind of man you noticed whether you wanted to or not. He was 32 years old, tall in the way that made doorways seem like suggestions, with dark hair that was just beginning to silver at the temples and eyes the color of the sky right before a storm makes up its mind. He wore his sheriff's badge the way other men wore scars, not as decoration, but as evidence of something survived. He had his hat in his hands. He was turning it slowly by the brim the way a man does when he is choosing his next words very carefully. "Miss Thatcher," he said. She blinked. "Sheriff Dalton." He glanced past her shoulder at the lamp, at the pressed blue dress, at the note she had not yet released from her left hand. His jaw shifted slightly. She had the unsettling sensation that he had already understood several things she had not yet admitted to herself. "I heard," he said, "that you might find yourself without an escort this evening." The silence between them was taut as a telegraph wire in winter. "Word travels fast in this town," she said. "It does," he agreed. He met her eyes and did not look away. "I'm traveling faster." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had observed from a respectful distance. This man whose dark past the town referenced in hushed voices without ever quite finishing the sentence. This man who moved through Millfield like he was always slightly apart from it, not cold exactly, but careful in a way that spoke of old damage done to something that had once been warm. She stepped back from the door. "Give me 5 minutes to finish pinning my hair," she said. A ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, something quieter and more surprising than either. "Take 10, he said. "The dance will keep." That was the night everything changed. But to understand how fully it changed, you have to go back to the beginning. Not just to the note that arrived at noon, not just to Holt Mercer's betrayal, but to the longer story that had been quietly assembling itself in Millfield, Texas, for the better part of 2 years, like a structure built in darkness that only reveals its shape when the light finally falls on it. Cora Thatcher had come to Millfield in the late spring of 1881, following her father's death and a letter from her father's old Army friend, a man named Gideon Webb who had settled in this part of West Texas and operated a modest lumber operation. The letter was not an offer of anything romantic. Gideon Webb was 60 years old and long married, but an offer of steadier ground. He knew her father had left her little but debt, and a small plot of land 20 miles outside of a town that had already begun to shrink, and he had written to say that if she wanted to make her way to Millfield, he would see that she had work at his general store for as long as she needed it. She had packed what she owned into a single trunk and taken the stage. Millfield in 1881 was a town of 412 people, most of them cattlemen or the families of cattlemen, with a handful of merchants and 2 churches, and a saloon that pretended it was something else on Sundays. The land was hard and the sky was enormous, and the dust got into everything, into your flour, into your hair, into the creases of your knuckles when you worked outside. But there was also something fierce and alive about it that Cora had not expected, some quality of the light in the morning that made you feel like the world was still deciding what it wanted to be. She had taken a small cabin on the south edge of town, close enough to walk to the general store, far enough to have a garden if she wanted one. She had planted tomatoes and beans and a rosebush that her mother had grown from a cutting years ago, and she had tended the store 6 days a week and learned the names of everyone in town within the first month because that was simply who she was, a woman with an excellent memory and a genuine interest in people that was not performance. She was good at her work. She was careful with accounts and patient with difficult customers, and she could lift a 50-pound sack of grain without asking for assistance, which she knew some people found surprising and others found quietly admirable. She made friends. She built a life, and she noticed Clark Dalton. It was difficult not to. He had been sheriff of Millfield for 6 years when she arrived, which meant the town had shaped itself partly around his presence, the way water shapes itself around a stone. You could see the impression he had made in the quieter streets, the fewer public disturbances, the particular way trouble seemed to approach Millfield and then rethink its decision. He was respected in the way that was harder to earn than admiration, which is the kind of respect that comes from people watching you do something difficult and do it without complaint. But he was also, unmistakably, a man carrying something heavy. Cora had gathered the outlines of it the way you gather a picture from fragments, a word here, a silence there, the way people in town finished their sentences about him with a slight drop in tone that meant there was more they were choosing not to say. What she pieced together over time was this. Before Millfield, Clark Dalton had served as a deputy marshal in Abilene, Kansas, and before that he had been a cattle rancher's son who had ridden with a rough outfit in his early 20s, not outlaws exactly, but the kind of men who occupied the gray territory between the law and the absence of it. He had left that life deliberately and with some cost to himself. And then in Abilene there had been something else, something to do with a woman named Elise and a trial that went wrong, and a decision that Clark had made that he apparently still reviewed in the middle of the night when sleep refused to come. Nobody in Millfield knew the full story. He had never told it, and because he had never told it, the space where the story should have been had filled up with speculation and mythology, and Cora had been careful to give that speculation no credit whatsoever and to form her own impressions from observation rather than gossip. What she observed was this: Clark Dalton was fair. He was honest to the point of discomfort sometimes. He was quietly funny when he allowed himself to be, which was not often enough. He noticed things, a crack in the road before it became a danger, a stranger in town whose posture said something different than his words, a woman standing in the door of the general store looking out at the rain, with an expression she had not meant anyone to see. He had seen her like that exactly once, in October of 1882, and she had startled and said something ordinary about the weather, and he had responded in kind, and they had both pretended the moment of real visibility had not occurred. But she had thought about it afterwards with a frequency that she found both inconvenient and informative. The inconvenient truth was that she was drawn to Clark Dalton in the deep, inconvenient way that is nothing like a passing fancy, and everything like recognizing something you have been looking for without admitting you were looking. And the equally inconvenient truth was that he gave no indication, none, zero, not a syllable of seeing her as anything other than a resident of Millfield who was pleasant to speak with, and whose accounts at the general store were always in order. So when Holt Mercer had smiled at her in the general store 3 weeks ago and pressed his hat to his chest and asked about the dance, she had said yes. Because she was practical, and because she was lonely, and because she told herself that a woman who waited for the impossible was a woman who spent her life standing in doorways. She had been wrong about Holt Mercer in every conceivable direction. The man had the shiniest surface of anyone she had ever met, and the least substance beneath it. He talked about himself the way a riverboat gambler shuffles cards, constantly, smoothly, in a way designed to dazzle rather than reveal. He had told her she was the most remarkable woman in Millfield the first time they spoke at length, and she had felt the flattery land sweetly before she noticed that the word remarkable was doing a great deal of work and meaning nothing at all. His courtship, if it could be called that, had been exactly 3 weeks of Sundays at the church social and one supper at the hotel dining room, where he had spoken for most of the meal about a land deal he was pursuing and glanced at the door twice, with an expression she had not understood at the time but understood perfectly now. He had been looking for the Calloway family. He had been calculating. And she had been the respectable widow's alternative. Not a widow, she corrected herself. A woman on her own that a man courts when his real target is not yet secured, so that he appears to have options and therefore appears worth wanting. The humiliation of it was not sharp and immediate the way a slap is. It was slow and thorough, like water finding its way into a poorly sealed foundation. She felt it seeping into places she had thought were sound. Standing at the mirror in her blue dress, pinning the last of her hair into place, she made herself look at her own reflection with the directness she would have used on a ledger she suspected of containing an error. What she saw was a woman of 26 with dark eyes and a composed face and a dress that fit beautifully and a heart that was, if she was honest, more insulted than broken. Because the truth, the real truth, past the sting of it, was that she had not been in love with Holt Mercer. She had been in love with the idea that someone had chosen her, and there was a significant difference. She finished pinning her hair. She opened her front door. And Clark Dalton was standing there with his hat in his hands, and the whole wide Texas evening behind him going amber and violet at the edges. And everything she had arranged inside herself shifted without warning like furniture in an earthquake. He had changed into a clean dark coat over his work shirt, and he had shaved, and he was still wearing his badge because Clark Dalton was constitutionally incapable of pretending he was not the sheriff even on an evening that required pretending. She found, to her own surprise, that she liked this about him. She liked the refusal to perform a version of himself that was easier to look at. She told him 5 minutes. She took 8. When she came out and pulled the door closed behind her and turned to find him still there, still patient, still turning that hat brim slowly in his hands, something warm moved through her chest that she did not have a name for yet. He extended his arm. She took it. They walked down the main road toward the Millfield Community Hall, and the evening was cooling around them, and the first stars were just beginning to show themselves in the deep blue above the tree line, and neither of them spoke for almost a full minute, which should have been awkward and somehow was not. "You did not have to do this," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Then why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man avoiding the question, but the quiet of a man taking it seriously. "Because I walked past your cabin this afternoon, and I saw you taking that dress off the door hook where you had it hanging," he said. "And I knew what that meant. And I thought about it for 3 hours, and then I did something about it." She looked at him. The street lamp at the corner was throwing just enough light to see his profile, that careful, serious face that gave so little away and yet somehow in this particular moment was giving away quite a lot. "You watched me through my window," she said. She kept her voice entirely level. A flicker of something that was definitely humor crossed his face. "I walked past your window," he said. "There is a distinction." "There is a very small distinction," she said. "I am the law in this town, Miss Thatcher. I am professionally committed to distinctions." She laughed. It came out before she had the chance to evaluate it. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and she felt his arm shift slightly under her hand, a small, involuntary tightening that he probably did not mean for her to notice, and that she noticed entirely. The community hall was already bright and loud when they arrived. Someone had strung lanterns from the rafters, and the fiddle, and the banjo, and the harmonica were all going at once with the particular enthusiastic imprecision of musicians, who are more committed than technically skilled. The floor had been swept, and the benches pushed to the walls, and the center of the room was already full of couples moving in the uncomplicated, joyful patterns of a Virginia reel. They arrived together, and the room noticed. Cora felt it the way you feel weather changing, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, heads turning in the peripheral, conversations pausing and resuming in a slightly altered key. She kept her chin level and her expression pleasant. She had not survived 2 years in a small town by being rattled by the attention of other people. Clark noticed it too. He noticed everything. But he did not change his pace or his expression, and he kept his hand correctly placed at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd to where the Webb family had staked out a section of bench near the punch table. And Gideon Webb looked up and registered Clark Dalton's presence beside Cora with exactly the expression of a man whose private calculations have just been confirmed. "Sheriff," Gideon said. "Gideon," Clark said. They shook hands with the ease of men who have handled each other's company for years and found it straightforward. Gideon's wife, Martha, a stout, warm-eyed woman of 55 who had been one of Cora's first friends in Millfield, squeezed Cora's hand and said nothing, and said everything with the squeeze. The evening moved the way good evenings do when you stop trying to manage them. The music was imperfect and lively. The punch was too sweet. The crowd was full of people Cora knew, and she talked with them. And she danced twice with Gideon Webb, who was an enthusiastic if geographically imprecise dancer. And she watched Clark Dalton from across the room as he spoke with the town alderman, and then the blacksmith, and then a rancher named Pierce who always looked worried regardless of circumstance. She was trying to read him and finding, as she always did, that he was not an easy text. He was at ease here, easier, she thought, than she had expected. He smiled genuinely at something the blacksmith said. He bent down to speak with Gideon's youngest grandchild, a boy of 4 who had apparently decided that the sheriff was the most important person at the dance, and had attached himself to Clark's trouser leg with the confidence of someone who has never been told his attachment is inconvenient. Clark dealt with this with complete gravity, crouching to the boy's level and listening with the full seriousness of a man receiving an official report. Something about this undid her a little. When the fiddle player announced a slower tune and the couples rearranged themselves accordingly, Clark crossed the room to where Cora was standing and held out his hand without ceremony, palm up, the question implicit and patient. She placed her hand in his. They danced carefully at first, the careful, measured distance of two people who are newly close to each other and aware of it. He led well, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the way he guided her without pressure, the way his hand at her back was respectful and somehow still present, not a polite gesture but an actual contact. "You're lighter on your feet than I expected," she said. "I am consistently underestimated," he said. There was no complaint in it, just a dry, factual quality that made her want to smile. "Is that so? You thought I'd lumber," he said. "All sheriffs lumbers, it's what people expect." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He looked at her directly, and up close the gray in his eyes was more complex than it appeared from a distance, more warm somehow, like the color of dawn over stone. "You have an expressive face, Miss Thatcher. You think people don't notice. They do." She held his gaze. "What does it say right now?" The question surprised him. She could see that, a brief, genuine flash of something unguarded before the careful quality returned. But it did not entirely return. "Right now," he said slowly, "it says that you are deciding whether or not to trust me." She considered this. The music was slow and the lanterns were gold overhead and the warm smell of the Texas night was coming through the open windows, all mesquite and dark earth. "And what would you say," she asked, "to help me decide?" He guided her through a turn, and when she came back to facing him he said, very quietly, "I would say that I have been watching you for 2 years, Cora Thatcher, and not once have I seen you be anything but honest, and I think you deserve that returned." She felt the sound of her given name on his tongue do something entirely improper to her composure. She kept her expression very steady and felt everything underneath it shift dramatically. "That's a start," she said. He nodded once, gravely. "I know." They danced through that song and into the next one, and she stopped counting and stopped analyzing and simply was there, in the community hall in Millfield, Texas, on the 23rd of August, 1883, dancing with the sheriff who had appeared at her door when she had believed the evening was going to be a lesson in disappointment. It was not a small thing. She understood, as the music moved through her, that whatever had happened in this room tonight was not something that would fold away neatly and be placed back in the category of casual acquaintance. Something had crossed a line, and she was not afraid of it. What she was, she realized with a quiet clarity that arrived without ceremony, was grateful. Grateful and more than a little terrified, and something much brighter than either. Later, when the dancing had moved to its final reel and the children were falling asleep on the benches, and the energy of the room was shifting from festive to warm and winding down, Cora found herself standing near the open side door where the night air was coming in cool and clean. She was watching the last dancers, a smile still on her face, when she became aware of a conversation happening just outside the door. 2 voices. Men. She did not mean to listen, but the acoustics of the doorway made it impossible not to. The first voice she identified immediately, Holt Mercer. He was here. She had not seen him arrive, and she felt a spike of something cold and defensive move through her before she controlled it. The second voice was unfamiliar. "You made your decision," the unfamiliar voice was saying. It was low and unhurried, with a flatness to it that did not belong to small talk. "And now there are expectations." "I told you I needed more time," Holt said. His voice had lost the oil-slick quality. He sounded like a different person. He sounded, Cora thought, genuinely afraid. "Time is not something Mr. Voss extends freely," the other voice said. "You know what he's done with the other parcels. The Thatcher girl's land is the last piece. You were supposed to secure it through her." Cora's blood went cold. "Through her." The words settled into her like stones into water, one by one finding the bottom. "She's not going to sell," Holt said. "I couldn't get close enough. And now she's here with Dalton, which means you failed," the other voice said. "And Mr. Voss does not much care for failure, Mercer. I would think carefully about your next move." Footsteps, then silence. Cora stood very still in the doorway, her hand against the wooden frame, her heart going with a hard, insistent rhythm that she could feel in her fingertips. The land. Her father's land, the 20 acres she had not yet sold, the plot outside of town that she had been holding, because selling it felt like releasing the last solid thing she had of him. Someone wanted it. Someone had sent Holt Mercer to court her, not for her, not even slightly for her, but as a calculated method of gaining access to that land. His courtship had been a trap. Every smile, every pressed hat, every comment about her being the most remarkable woman in Millfield had been strategy rather than sincerity. The humiliation she had felt at noon, reading that note, had been aimed at entirely the wrong thing. The real wound was this. She turned from the doorway and nearly walked directly into Clark Dalton's chest. He caught her arm. She looked up at him. Something in her face communicated itself immediately. She watched him read it, watched the sheriff part of him engage that precise and rapid assessment he made of situations. "What happened?" he said. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Outside, not here." He did not ask twice. He simply turned and guided her through the side door and around the corner of the building to where the night was quiet and the lantern light did not reach, and they were alone with the sound of the fiddle going faint through the walls. She told him everything she had heard. She said it clearly and in the right order because she was someone who dealt in facts when facts were available. She watched his face as she spoke, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the deepening of the lines around his mouth, the way his jaw set when she said the name Voss. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Raymond Voss. You know him." "I know of him," Clark said. He looked at her with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. "He has been acquiring land west of town for 2 years. He's been doing it quietly through agents, through debt collection, through means that are legally ambiguous but not quite prosecutable. I have been watching it." He paused. "I had not connected it to your father's land." She felt the weight of this settle. "What does he want it for?" "The railroad is coming through this part of Texas," Clark said. "Not the main line, a spur line. And the route runs across land that connects directly to the acreage west of town. Whoever owns those parcels when the railroad comes will be able to sell at prices that dwarf anything the land has ever been worth for ranching or farming." He looked at her steadily. "Your father's 20 acres is the connector piece. Without it, the contiguous block Voss has been assembling doesn't function as a sellable unit to the railroad." She thought about her father. She thought about the letters he had written in his last months, the careful, deliberate letters of a man putting things in order, and one of them had said, "Do not sell the land west of town quickly, Cora, wait and be patient with it." She had thought he meant emotionally, that the grief would be too fresh. He had meant something else entirely. "He knew," she said softly. "My father knew about the railroad." Clark was watching her with something she could not immediately name. Not pity, he was not a man who offered pity. She thought it would have felt wrong in his hands. It was something more careful. A kind of attentiveness that meant, "I see what this costs you, and I am not going to look away from it." "Your father was a careful man," Clark said. "From what Gideon has told me, yes. He saw things coming. He tried to protect you." She pressed her hands flat against the wood siding of the community hall and breathed the cool August night and let herself feel the full shape of what had just been revealed. Betrayal was the word for it, she supposed, but betrayal implied she had trusted Holt Mercer with anything real, and she had not. What she had trusted him with was a few evenings and a yes to a dance invitation. The deeper betrayal was more abstract. That kindness and loneliness could be leveraged by the right kind of calculated man. She would not let that happen again. She turned back to Clark. "What do I need to do?" He looked at her for a long moment, and in the lamplight spilling from the hall windows she could see the full seriousness of his attention, that quality in him that she had observed from a distance and now felt turned fully on her with no distance at all. "For now," he said, "nothing. Do not respond to any offers on the land. Do not discuss it with anyone new." And he paused, something moving behind his eyes that she could not read. "Trust me to look into this the right way." Do, she said. It came out before she had authorized it. She heard it land in the air between them and did not retract it because it was true. His expression changed in some way that was small and consequential. Then let's go back inside, he said quietly. And let's dance the last dance and not give Mr. Holt Mercer the satisfaction of seeing anything other than a woman having a good evening. She smoothed the front of her blue dress and lifted her chin and said, "That I can certainly manage." He offered his arm again and she took it again and they went back inside and the fiddle was playing something slow and sweet, and the lanterns were burning low and Clark Dalton held her and they danced the last dance. And it was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary evening. He walked her home after. The road was lit by a three-quarter moon that made the dust silver and the mesquite trees into dark lace against the sky. They walked at the comfortable pace of people who have found each other's rhythm, not touching except where her hand rested on his arm. At her door, she turned to face him. He had his hat back in his hands, turning it by the brim again. She had come to recognize this as a tell. The turning hat meant he was composing something. "Thank you," she said, "for appearing at my door." "I'm glad I did," he said. "So am I." He looked at her hat in his hands, then back up at her. The moon was above him and his face was half in light and half in shadow, and she thought he looked like something that had been through weather and come through it straighter than expected. "Cora," he said, and again the sound of her name on his tongue did the improper thing to her composure. "I want to be honest with you about something." "Please," she said. "I have not been easy to know," he said. "In this town, I have kept my own counsel. There are things in my past that I did not handle as well as I should have, and I have carried that maybe too long. And I am not going to present myself to you as a man without complications because that would be dishonest." She watched him. "I would not believe it if you did," she said, something that was almost a smile. "No, I don't suppose you would." He looked at her steadily. "What I want you to know is that this tonight was not casual on my part. I am not a man who acts casually." "No," she agreed. "You are not. So I want you to know that," he said, "and I don't require an answer tonight. I only wanted to say it plainly." She held his gaze for a long, warm moment. The cricket sounds were immense around them, and the moon was still and the night smelled of dry grass and cooling earth. "I appreciate plain," she said. "It is a rarer quality than most people realize." She reached for the door handle. "Good night, Sheriff." "Good night, Miss Thatcher," he said, and she could hear in the way he said it that the formality was mutual play between them now, a small warm joke they had built in the space of a single evening. She went inside and closed the door and leaned her back against it in the dark room and stood there for a full minute, listening to the sound of his footsteps moving away down the road and the frogs beginning in the creek at the far edge of her property, and she pressed her hand flat against her own sternum and tried to take the accurate measure of what was happening in her chest. It was considerable. The next 3 weeks were the most carefully observed 3 weeks of Cora Thatcher's time in Millfield. She went about her days with the controlled, ordinary precision of someone who knows a situation is moving beneath the surface and has decided to wait for the right moment to engage it. Clark came into the general store on the second morning and bought a box of rifle cartridges and a length of rope, which was not unusual, and then he lingered at the counter slightly longer than the transaction required and said, in a voice meant only for her, that he had made some inquiries and was building a clear picture of Raymond Voss's operation, and that she should know he had found evidence of coercion in at least 2 of the prior land sales. An elderly couple named Grantham who had been told, through various subtle threats, that their water rights were in dispute and that it would be better for everyone if they simply sold and moved on. Cora had leaned against the counter and kept her voice equally low and said, "What kind of man is Voss? Directly, what am I dealing with?" Clark had looked at her in that assessing way. "A man who is intelligent and patient and completely indifferent to other people's suffering," he said. "The most dangerous kind." She had absorbed this. "How long before you have enough to act legally?" "Another week," he said. "Maybe 2. I've written to the federal marshal's office in Austin. They have jurisdiction over the coercion element if I can prove it crossed county lines." "And can you?" I believe so. She had nodded and sold him his cartridges and his rope and watched him leave, and then she had returned to her work with the steady, controlled energy of a woman who has been given a task and intends to see it through. In the evenings, he came by. Not every evening, once or twice a week, which was exactly the right frequency for two people who are discovering each other without making a performance of it. He would appear at her door in the early evening when the light was still gold, and sometimes they walked and sometimes they sat on her porch with coffee, and sometimes he helped her with small repairs she had been meaning to make to the cabin, a loose hinge, a window that had warped in the summer heat and would not close properly, working with a quiet, competent thoroughness that she found deeply appealing. He talked more than she had expected. Not constantly, not indiscriminately, but when she asked him things he answered with a completeness that felt like a choice he was making deliberately, and she understood that for a man who had apparently made a practice of keeping his own counsel, this was a significant offering. She learned about his childhood in East Texas, a rancher's son, the third of four, the one who had always been most preoccupied by questions of right and wrong in a household where those questions were considered either settled or inconvenient. She learned that the rough outfit he had ridden with in his early 20s was something he talked about with a clear-eyed lack of self-protection. He had made choices then that he was not proud of, nothing that crossed into genuine lawlessness, but enough that he had understood viscerally how the line between legal and not was thinner than most comfortable people wanted to believe. He told her about Abilene over the course of several evenings, in pieces, the way you tell something that is still not entirely comfortable in the telling. A woman named Elise, a saloon man who had beaten her, repeatedly, who had wealth enough to make prosecution complicated. Clark had been deputy marshal and he had built a case and taken it to trial, and it had come apart, not because of lack of evidence, but because the judge had been in the saloon man's pocket. Something Clark had not known until the acquittal came through, and he had walked out of that courthouse and looked at Elise's face and seen what it looks like when a person runs out of hope in a single moment. She had left Abilene within the week. He did not know where she had gone. The saloon man had died 2 years later of a heart attack, which Clark had learned without satisfaction, because the moment for justice had already passed. And Clark had left Abilene too and come to Millfield and built something here that was more careful and more certain than anything he had managed before. Cora listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished on the third evening of the telling, she said, "You blame yourself." "I made errors," he said. "You did not make the judge corrupt," she said. "No, but I trusted a system I should have verified." He was looking at his coffee cup. "She paid for my trust." Cora was quiet for a moment. The porch light was low, and the night was full of its own sounds around them, and she chose her words with the care she would have given a difficult letter. "You cannot be responsible for the dishonesty of others," she said, "only for your own, and from what you've told me you were honest in everything you did. You built a real case, you pursued it the right way. The failure belonged to a corrupt judge." He looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "I make it sound accurate," she said. "There's a difference." She met his eyes. "The guilt you're carrying is partly for something that wasn't yours to carry, and carrying it has cost you things." He was very still. The night sounded large around them. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm working on putting it down." She nodded once. She did not offer comfort in the form of easy absolution because she did not think he wanted that or would believe it. What she offered instead was the continued fact of her presence and the truth she had just spoken, and she let those stand without addition. After a moment he said, "You are not like anyone I have met in a long time, Cora Thatcher." She looked at him with the directness that was simply her manner. "How so?" "You are honest with people in a way that costs you nothing," he said. "Not because it's easy for you, but because you've decided it's the only way you're willing to operate. And that is—" He paused. The hat-turning thing again, she noticed, except he didn't have his hat. He was turning his coffee cup instead, slowly in his hands. "It's something I find very difficult to look away from." The warmth in her chest was considerable and growing. "Then don't," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes steady and warmer than stone in the evening light, and she felt the whole beautiful specific weight of this moment. This man, this porch, this August in Texas, the slow and certain way something that matters arrives in your life if you keep your eyes open. Then he smiled. A real one, full and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, took 10 years off it, made visible the man who was there underneath the careful sheriff-shaped exterior, the one who had been humorous with her on the walk to the dance, who had listened gravely to the report of Gideon's 4-year-old grandchild at the community hall, and she felt, with a completeness that left no room for doubt, that she was in love with this man. She had not been in love with anyone before. She had thought she understood the shape of it from the novels she had read, and the way married couples in town moved around each other with the knowledge of long familiarity. But the actual experience of it was different from any description she had encountered. It was not dreamy or soft-focused. It was specific and clear and slightly alarming in its certainty. It had the quality of something coming into focus rather than something blurring. She did not say this to him. It was too new and too large, and the situation with Raymond Voss was still unresolved, and she was not a woman who confused the timing of things. But she kept it. She held it carefully inside herself and let it be what it was. The resolution of the Raymond Voss situation came on a Tuesday in mid-September, and it came faster and more dramatically than Clark had anticipated, because Raymond Voss was a man who, like most men who are used to operating in the gray, could not tolerate uncertainty and eventually made a move too quickly. The move was this. He sent 2 men to Cora's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon when he believed, incorrectly, that Clark was occupied with a dispute between ranchers on the north end of the county. The 2 men were not violent, at least not immediately, but they were large and practiced at the specific kind of intimidation that does not leave marks. One of them put his hand on her fence post and looked at her cabin and said that Mr. Voss was prepared to offer a fair price for the land, and that it would be in her best interest to accept it before the offer changed. Cora stood in her own doorway in her working dress with her hand on the door frame and looked at them with a steady, open expression that gave them nothing. She asked them their names. They declined to give them. She asked them to convey to Mr. Voss that she was not interested in selling. They told her she should think more carefully. She said she had thought carefully, and her answer was no, and she would like them to leave her property. The larger of the 2 men took a step toward the porch and said something that was intended to be frightening, and in that moment Cora heard hoofbeats behind them. Clark Dalton rode into her yard at a controlled, unhurried pace that was somehow more authoritative than anything fast or dramatic. He dismounted with the economy of movement of a man who has ridden his whole life, and he stood between Cora's porch and the 2 men, and he said, in his most level voice, "Gentlemen, I am going to need you to step off this woman's property." He was not pointing a gun. He did not need to. He was the law in Millfield, and every line of his body knew it and made certain they knew it also. The 2 men looked at each other. Something passed between them, a private calculation, and then the larger one looked at Clark and said, "This is a civil matter, Sheriff." "Civil matters do not require 2 men on a woman's property uninvited," Clark said. He walked closer slowly until the 3 of them were at a range where posturing became more complicated. "Now, names." They gave them. Clark wrote them in the small notebook he carried. He told them to leave Millfield and not return until they had cause to. And he said this with the quality of a man giving instructions that he expects to be followed, not because of threat, but because of accumulated authority, and they left. When they had ridden out of the yard, he turned to Cora. She was still in the doorway. He came up the porch steps, and she thought for a moment that he was going to reach for her, and she found she had made peace with this completely. But instead he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her face with that close, concerned attention. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm angry." "Good," he said. "Stay angry. It's cleaner than frightened." "I was not frightened," she said precisely. "I know," he said, and she could hear in those 2 words that this was a fact he had simply known about her. But they will not come back. And it means Voss is making a mistake. He's getting impatient. An impatient man makes legal errors. He held her gaze. The federal marshal arrives from Austin on Thursday. The Grantham coercion documentation is solid. By the end of next week, Voss's operation will be the federal government's problem and not just mine. She exhaled slowly. Good, she said. And my land is yours, he said, entirely and completely. No one can take it from you. She looked at him standing on her porch in the afternoon light and thought about all the evenings and all the conversations and the slow, careful building of something real, and she decided the timing was, in fact, exactly right. Clark, she said. Just the name. His first name the first time she had used it without the title. His expression changed in that way. It did something warming behind the careful surface. There is something I want to say to you, she said, plainly. Please, he said. I love you, she said. I have been in love with you for longer than I realized, and I have known it clearly for several weeks. I am not saying this to complicate the current situation. I am saying it because you told me on the first night that honesty should be returned, and I am returning it. He stood very still. His gray eyes were entirely on her, and she could see in them something that was large and complicated and had been kept in a careful box for a significant amount of time. Then he crossed the 2 feet between them in one step and put his hands on either side of her face, gentle and precise as everything he did, and he kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not polite. It was the kiss of a man who has been composing himself for weeks in the face of considerable provocation, and has just been given permission to stop composing. She kissed him back with the matching clarity of a woman who has decided what she wants and gone toward it without apology. When they separated, she was slightly out of breath and entirely undignified and felt about 17 kinds of wonderful. I love you, he said, his hands still at her face, his forehead very nearly touching hers. I have been trying not to rush you, and I have found it a pause, the driest possible expression. Challenging. She laughed, that full, unguarded laugh, and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder and felt his arms come around her. And they stood on her porch in the September afternoon, with the garden behind them and the rosebush still blooming red at the far edge, and the whole wide Texas sky above them. And it was the simplest and most complete thing she had felt in a very long time. The federal marshal arrived on Thursday, as Clark had said. His name was Randall Hatch, a methodical, sun-weathered man of 50 who had the look of someone who had seen every variety of human dishonesty and found each new example only mildly surprising. Clark presented his documentation. The Grantham coercion, the paper trail linking 3 of Voss's agents to a pattern of fraudulent debt claims, and the testimony he had collected from 2 separate witnesses to the conversations that had taken place regarding Cora's land. Holt Mercer, faced with federal questioning and a set of documented evidence that implicated him in the conspiracy, made the predictable choice of the man who has always operated close to the comfortable center and finds himself in genuinely dangerous territory. He cooperated entirely. He told Hatch everything. He confirmed Raymond Voss's role in directing the operation, named the 2 men who had appeared at Cora's cabin, and provided correspondence that had been kept in a lockbox at the Millfield Hotel where he had been staying. Raymond Voss was arrested in San Antonio on a Saturday in early October. He was extradited to answer federal charges in Austin. The Grantham family was compensated. The fraudulent debt claims against 2 other small landowners were voided. The whole structure that Voss had been quietly building across this section of West Texas came apart in the specific way that things built on coercion and dishonesty tend to come apart, completely, once a real accounting has been made. Holt Mercer left Millfield 2 days after the federal marshal's departure. No one was particularly sorry to see him go, and Cora found that her feelings about his departure were remarkably uncomplicated. She wished him nothing dramatic, not ill will, not vindication, not anything that required energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. He was simply gone, and the space he had briefly occupied closed up like water over a stone. The space Clark Dalton occupied was another matter entirely. October in Millfield was easier than August. The brutal heat of summer had broken, and the air had a cool clarity that made everything seem a little more possible. The sky was that deep specific blue of Texas autumn, and the light came in at a low angle in the mornings that made even ordinary things look considered. Clark and Cora had stopped maintaining any pretense about the nature of their connection, which in a town of 412 people meant that absolutely everyone knew what was happening and had opinions about it. Martha Webb had expressed something in the vicinity of triumphant satisfaction when Cora had told her, quietly, one morning at the store. Gideon had shaken Clark's hand again, this time with a different quality of weight to it. The Millfield Baptist minister had mentioned, at Sunday service, in what was clearly a pointed but technically general observation, that the institution of marriage was the bedrock of civilized community, and half the congregation had looked at Clark and Cora had looked at the middle distance with identical expressions of composed innocence. He asked her in November. He did it without performance. They were at her kitchen table after supper, with the lamp burning and the wind picking up outside and the sound of it moving through the mesquite, and he had put down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table with that direct, serious quality that she now associated with his most important moments, and he said, "I want to marry you, Cora. I want to do this properly, and I want to say it plainly because that is the only way I know how to be with you. I want you to be my wife, and I want to build a life with you here. Not because the town expects it or because it is the correct next step, but because I cannot imagine a future that makes sense without you at the center of it, and I have tried, and the imagining is significantly worse than the present." She looked at him across the lamplit table and felt everything in her that was measured and composed and carefully calibrated simply release, the way a held breath releases, the way hands open after holding something tightly for too long. "Yes," she said. Without reservation, Clark, yes. He took her hand across the table, and his thumb moved over her knuckles in a slow, certain way, and they sat there in the warm circle of lamp light with the wind outside, and the whole rest of their lives waiting quietly beyond the door. They were married in the Millfield Baptist Church on the second Saturday of December, 1883. It was a clear, cold day with a sky so blue it looked like it had been deliberately chosen. The church was full. In a town of 412 people, a wedding between the sheriff and the woman from the general store was not a small event, and every bench was occupied, and there were people standing at the back, not out of nosiness but out of genuine warmth, the feeling that accrues in small communities when two people that everyone has been quietly rooting for finally arrive at the moment. Cora wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, with her mother's ivory brooch at the collar, and she walked down the aisle of the church on Gideon Webb's arm because Gideon was the closest thing to family she had in this part of the world, and he walked with the precision of a man who has been entrusted with something precious and means to discharge the trust without error. Clark was waiting for her at the front of the church. He was in his best dark suit without the badge for once, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, entirely open, all the careful quality absent, just the man underneath it, exposed and present and completely unashamed of it. She almost stopped walking. She made herself continue slowly, all the way to where he was standing, and when she reached him he took her hands and his eyes were slightly bright, and she thought, "There he is. There is the whole of him." The minister performed the ceremony, and they made their promises to each other in front of 412 people, and every word of it was true. When Clark kissed her at the conclusion of the ceremony, the room made a sound that was warm and collective and wholly pleased, and she felt the sound move through her like music. The winter in Millfield was mild that year, which the older ranchers said was unusual and the minister said was providential, and Cora thought it was simply lucky. And luck, she had learned, should be received with gratitude rather than dissected. She kept working at the general store through the winter, not because she had to, but because she liked it, and because Gideon's health was beginning to require more care than he would admit, and she wanted to be there. Clark had suggested gently that she didn't need to continue if she found it taxing, and she had explained, equally gently, that she found it the opposite of taxing, and that she was not the kind of person who stopped being useful because her circumstances had improved. He had accepted this in the way he accepted most of her firmly stated positions, with a small nod and a complete absence of argument, which was one of several things she loved about him. The land west of town they decided together to hold. Clark had made inquiries about the railroad timeline and confirmed what her father had evidently known. The spur line was coming, within 2 or 3 years most likely, and the land would be worth considerably more when it did. In the meantime, they leased the grazing rights to a nearby rancher at a fair rate, which gave them a modest additional income and put the land to use while they waited. This felt, to Cora, like something her father would have appreciated. She told Clark that one evening, and he said, "I think he was a man who looked forward," and she said, "Yes, he was, he would have liked you." And Clark had been quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something touched something real in him, and then he said, "I hope so." Spring came. The town of Millfield was 418 people by April, having acquired 6 new residents including a schoolteacher from Ohio named Miss Harriet Bales who wore spectacles, and had opinions about the organization of the new schoolroom that caused the school board some consternation, and caused Cora considerable private delight. Cora discovered, one warm morning in April, that she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for the better part of a day before she told Clark. Not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted a moment to simply be alone with it. This quiet seismic fact, this whole new person existing in the future who was not yet visible, but was already making himself or herself known through a persistent morning nausea that Cora found inconvenient but not ungrateful for. She told him that evening on the porch. She said it directly, the way she said everything, looking at him in the twilight and watching his face. His response was not the large, demonstrative response of a man performing emotion. It was something smaller and truer, a stillness, a breath, and then he reached across and took her hand and pressed it flat against his palm and looked down at their joined hands and then back up at her with an expression that she had never seen on any human face before and that she recognized immediately as joy in its most genuine form. "Cora," he said, just her name. "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and then they sat in the spring evening for a long time, while the stars came out one by one, and said almost nothing else, because almost nothing else was necessary. Their son was born in early December of 1884, on a cold, clear night with the stars very bright over Millfield, Texas. Dr. Abernathy delivered him and declared him healthy and large, and in complete possession of an excellent pair of lungs, all of which proved accurate. Clark held him for the first time with the particular careful astonishment of a man who has not held an infant since his own siblings were young, handling this new person with enormous precision, as though he were something that required exceptionally good judgment. He looked up at Cora from where she was propped against the pillows, exhausted and completely incandescent, and said, "He has your eyes." "He has your nose," she said. "Poor boy," Clark said, and she laughed, which pulled at muscles that were not prepared for laughing, and she laughed anyway. They named him James Gideon Dalton. James for Cora's father and Gideon for the man who had written a letter that had, in a chain of causes and effects she would spend years tracing with gratitude, led her to this town and this life and this particular December night. Gideon Webb, upon being informed of this honor, became temporarily incapable of speech and had to sit down, and Martha Webb cried in a manner that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this kind of occasion for some time. James Gideon Dalton was, From the first days of his existence, a person of very decided opinions and great physical energy, and an expression of focused interest in the world around him that Clark said was clearly inherited from his mother, and Cora said was clearly inherited from his father, and both of them were right. The spring after James was born, the railroad came. It came the way large things come, with noise and disruption, and the complete reorganization of what had been ordinary. The survey crews arrived first, then the graders, then the crews laying track, and the town of Millfield expanded with the speed of a place that has suddenly been connected to the larger world. New people arrived. New businesses opened. The population climbed from 400 to 600 to nearly 800 within 2 years. Clark and Cora sold a portion of the West Land to the railroad at the price that made clear why her father had told her to wait, and what remained they kept as a foundation for the years ahead, which now seemed expansive and certain in a way that earlier years had not. The general store expanded. Gideon Webb, who had been unwell through most of the winter of 1885, recovered enough in the spring to resume working abbreviated hours. But by the summer, it was apparent that his health required a more significant adjustment to his routine, and he and Martha had a long and practical conversation with Cora about the future of the business. The conclusion of this conversation was that Gideon sold the store to Cora at a price that was more generosity than transaction, and retired to a house on the quieter end of Millfield, where Martha grew a garden of extraordinary ambition and Gideon read newspapers, and held strong opinions about things happening in Washington and spoiled James Gideon Dalton with the specific intensity of a man who has discovered grandfatherhood as a late vocation. Cora ran the store with the same competence and directness she had always brought to it, only now as its owner, and she hired a young man named Roy Estelle, who was 19 and hardworking and could lift more than twice what she could, and between the two of them the business thrived. Clark continued as sheriff through the changes that the railroad brought to Millfield, which required considerable adaptability because a town of 800 that has been connected to the larger world develops a different kind of trouble than a town of 400 that exists in relative isolation. He handled this with the same deliberate, clear-principled authority he had always brought to the work, and he told Cora over supper one night that he thought it was time to deputize properly, to find someone capable and train them with care, not because he was tired of the work, but because the work was expanding beyond what a single man could do responsibly, and he had learned, he said, that the difference between a man who trusts himself to do everything and a man who builds something that will outlast him is the difference between individual effort and institution. She told him this was the wisest thing she had heard him say, which was notable since she found him consistently wise. He hired 2 deputies that winter. One of them was a young man of 22 named Cal Briggs, who was from a local ranching family and had the combination of good sense and physical courage that Clark required. The other was a woman, which caused some discussion in the town, but not as much as might have been expected, because people in Millfield had spent 3 years watching Clark Dalton operate on the principle that competence was competence, and was not made more or less so by the particular person possessing it, and they had come to understand that this was not a man whose decisions were made to be argued with. The woman's name was Frances Rook. She was 24, a former Pinkerton operative from Chicago who had come west for health reasons and stayed because she found the life suited her. She was excellent at her work, and Clark trained her with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and within 6 months she was his most reliable deputy. Cora liked her immediately, with the direct recognition one capable woman gives another. In the summer of 1887, Cora discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Clark the same evening she knew, because she had learned that the impulse to keep things to herself, an old survival habit from years of managing alone, was something she could now release without loss. He was the right person to tell immediately. Their daughter was born in February of 1888, during a brief cold snap that frosted the windows of the house they had moved into the previous year. A larger house on the north side of town, 2 stories, with a porch that wrapped 3 sides and a kitchen big enough to be a genuine room rather than a corner. Clark held his daughter for the first time with the same careful astonishment he had brought to holding James 3 years before, and the expression on his face was the same joy, unperformed and complete. They named her Ruth Eleanor Dalton. Ruth for no particular reason except that they both thought it was a strong and straightforward name. Eleanor for Cora's mother, who had died when Cora was 15, and who had been, from everything Cora could piece together from memory and a few faded letters, a woman of great quiet strength and significant internal life. Ruth Eleanor Dalton came into the world with a full set of opinions from the first week, and grew into a child who combined Clark's directness with Cora's precision in a way that made both of them occasionally speechless. James, as an older brother, found her alternately exhausting and entertaining, which seemed to Cora like an entirely appropriate fraternal response. The house filled up with the specific warm chaos of a family in progress, boots by the door, books on every flat surface, Clark's maps of the county pinned in the study next to the drawings James brought home from school, Ruth's collection of smooth river stones arranged along the windowsill of the kitchen in a system of organization she had devised and explained at length, and that no one else was allowed to alter. Clark came home in the evenings to all of it. Cora watched him come through the door and set his hat on the hook and shrug out of his coat and become, in the space of 30 seconds, not the sheriff but her husband and the father of these 2 particular children, and the transition was something she never tired of watching. The careful quality was still there. It was woven into who he was. She had understood early on, but it lived alongside things that were warm and open and entirely unguarded in the space of their home. He told her once, on a winter evening when the children were asleep and the house was quiet around them and the lamp was burning low, that he had spent many years convinced that the damage he had accumulated was simply the shape he would keep, that the guilt and the careful distance he maintained from people were not conditions but characteristics, permanent and structural, and that she had, without agenda and without effort that was visible to him, simply declined to treat them as permanent, and that this had made it possible for him to decline as well. She had leaned against him on the settee and said, "I didn't do anything particular." "You did," he said. "You were honest with me even when it was uncomfortable. You didn't perform softness at me. You told me the truth about Elise, that the guilt was misplaced, without trying to fix me or forgive me. You just said the true thing." She was quiet for a moment. "I only said what was accurate." "Yes," he said, "that's all it took." He pressed his lips to her hair. "As it turns out." Gideon Webb died peacefully in the winter of 1889, which was a sorrow in the particular, dignified key of losing someone whose time has come, and who has left behind them a life of genuine quality. Cora was with him in his last days in the house on the quiet end of town, and Clark was there too, and Martha, and several people whose lives Gideon had touched in one way or another over 40 years of living in the places he had lived. He had been good to her. He had written a letter and offered her solid ground when she needed it. She carried that with a gratitude that was not nostalgic but active. She had tried to be to others what he had been to her, to offer what she could when she could, and she believed this was the only real answer to having been given something you did not earn. Martha Webb came to Sunday dinners at the Dalton house every week for years afterward, and was the children's appointed grandmother by common consensus of everyone involved, and brought pies that were consistently better than anything Cora could produce and showed no signs of letting this fact become modest. The years moved. The town of Millfield grew to 1,200 by the turn of the decade and acquired a new church, a proper school building, a hotel that was genuinely a hotel rather than a glorified boarding house, and 2 new doctors. Clark served as sheriff through all of it, through the growth and the complexity it brought, and was re-elected every 2 years without significant opposition, because the citizens of Millfield had built their trust in him over a decade of watching him be exactly who he said he was. In the spring of 1890, he came home one evening and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Cora across the supper she was setting out and said, in the tone he used for real things, "I am thinking about something. I want to talk it through with you." "All right," she said, sitting down. "The federal marshals have been in contact," he said. "They want to know if I would consider taking a regional appointment. Senior deputy marshal for the district. It would mean more travel. It would mean a different kind of work than local jurisdiction." She looked at him. "What kind of different, bigger cases? The kind that move across county lines. The kind I could not pursue properly as a local sheriff." He was watching her face. "The Voss situation, 7 years ago. There are versions of that happening across this territory that a local sheriff cannot touch. A federal appointment would change that." She understood immediately why this was calling to him, and she felt the pull of it on his behalf. He was someone whose sense of justice had a specific quality, not abstract but personal, rooted in the experience of having watched it fail, and having spent years making sure it didn't fail here in Millfield. The possibility of that work on a larger scale was something she could see in his eyes, even as he said it with the careful neutrality of a man who is making sure the choice belongs to both of them. She thought about James, who was 6, and Ruth, who was 2, and the house on the north side of town with the 3-sided porch, and the store, and Martha Webb's Sunday pies. She thought about the life they had built here, solid and specific and known. Then she thought about what he would be if he said no to this, whether the containment of it would, over time, cost something. "Could we stay in Millfield?" she asked. "Would the appointment require us to relocate?" "The regional office is in Fort Worth," he said. "I could commission work from here for a good portion of it. The travel would be frequent but not permanent." She nodded slowly. "Then I think you should take it," she said. "Not because I want you away more often, which I do not, but because this is work that matters to you in the deep way, and you are very good at it, and I refuse to be the reason you don't do it." He held her gaze across the table. "You are never a reason I don't do something, Cora. You are a reason I do things better." She felt the simple, precise beauty of this and let it land fully. "Take the appointment," she said. "We'll make it work. We're good at making things work." He took it. The work changed in the way he had expected and also in ways he had not. He traveled more. He came home with new kinds of tired, not the physical tired of daily local patrol, but the deeper tired of difficult decisions made far from home. Cora learned to read which kind of tired he was carrying when he walked through the door, and to respond accordingly. Sometimes it was supper and the noise of the children and the ordinary domestic resumption of life. Sometimes it was quiet, just the two of them after the children were in bed, sitting together with the lamp burning while he decompressed by degrees. He was good at the work, exceptionally good. The qualities that had made him a steady local sheriff, the patience, the precision, the absolute refusal to cut corners in his methods, made him formidable in the regional role. He built cases that held up. He closed situations that had remained open for years, because they required exactly the kind of meticulous, unhurried attention he brought to everything. He was home for James's 7th birthday in December of 1891, which Cora had organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything she cared about a cake that Martha Webb had helped bake to James's specific and detailed specifications, which involved multiple layers and a considerable quantity of chocolate frosting. Clark arrived the afternoon before the party after 3 weeks away and sat down on the kitchen floor when James ran at him, absorbing the full-body impact of a 7-year-old at velocity without flinching, and wrapped his arms around the boy and closed his eyes for a moment, and Cora, watching from the doorway, felt the love she had for this man do the thing it did sometimes, expand quietly, past the point she thought was its current limit, into something larger. Ruth, at 3, observed her father's return from the kitchen doorway with the judicial expression she had already made her signature, and then announced that she had been waiting a long time. And Clark said that he was deeply sorry and that he had something for her, and produced from his coat pocket a small carved wooden horse that someone in Fort Worth had sold him, and that Ruth accepted with the gravity it deserved. The years from 1890 to 1895 were the good years in the way that years can only be called good in retrospect, when you look back and see that what felt simply like life happening was actually the full accumulation of things you most wanted. Clark's work expanding and mattering in the ways he had hoped, the store thriving, James growing into a serious, curious boy who shared his father's interest in questions of fairness, and his mother's comfort with numbers. Ruth growing into a small force of nature, who had decided by age 4 that she would one day own a horse ranch, and by age 6 was already petitioning her parents for a riding lesson, with the focused determination of someone who has identified their vocation. Clark bought her a proper pony in the spring of 1893, a small, patient bay named Copper, and the expression on Ruth's face when she was lifted into the saddle for the first time was so precisely Clark's expression, that contained absolutely genuine joy that Cora laughed until her eyes watered. In the autumn of 1895, they discovered Cora was expecting a third child. She was 38, which was not young for such things, and Dr. Abernathy was thorough and measured in his assessment of the relevant considerations, and Clark listened to all of it with his most serious face, and then took both her hands and said, "What do you want?" "I want the baby," she said simply. "I am healthy and we have a good doctor and I want the baby." Their second son was born in the spring of 1896, on a warm April morning when the garden outside the bedroom window was coming up green, and the mockingbirds were going full voice in the mesquite tree. He arrived with the same excellent lungs as his older brother, and with a quantity of dark hair that made Dr. Abernathy comment approvingly. Clark held him and looked at Cora and said, "This family is very good at this." She laughed, which was again anatomically inconvenient and completely worth it. They named him Thomas Clark Dalton, Thomas because it was a name with weight and history to it. Clark because Cora had wanted, from the moment she understood she was carrying him, to give her husband's name somewhere permanent in the family record. Clark had been quiet when she told him what she wanted to name the baby. She had watched his face go through several things. Then he had said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I want to." Thomas Clark Dalton grew into a person who was entirely his own and not much like either sibling, which Cora found infinitely interesting. The mystery of where a person comes from, how two parents can produce three entirely distinct humans, each of them carrying fragments of the whole but arranged in completely original patterns. He was gentler than James's focused seriousness or Ruth's decisive energy. He was the one who found injured birds and brought them inside, and made meticulous small shelters for them from materials he collected with great purpose. He was the one who sat in the kitchen while Cora worked and talked about ideas, large, wandering conversations that could begin with why the sky changed color at sunset and arrive, by some internal logic only he could trace, at questions about fairness, and whether animals understood kindness, and what happened to a person's character when they were lonely for a long time. Clark, listening to these conversations, sometimes caught Cora's eye across the kitchen with an expression that meant, "He is going to be something remarkable, and we have no idea what it is yet." The century turned. Millfield grew into a town of 3,000, large enough now to have real municipal structure, an elected mayor, a city council, a full police department that had been established alongside Clark's sheriff's office, which remained the county law enforcement body, while Millfield proper developed its own local force. Clark's regional federal role had expanded to the point where it was effectively his primary work, with a trusted undersheriff handling most of the county day-to-day. In the spring of 1901, Clark announced at the supper table that he would be stepping back from the federal appointment at the end of the year. He was 50. He had done the work he had wanted to do, and he had done it well, and he was, he said, ready to be home more and present for the particular shape their life had taken before more of the particular shape passed. James was 17. Ruth was 13. Thomas was 5. Clark had missed things while traveling. He knew the names of what he had missed: birthdays, school performances, the specific ordinary evenings that accrued into the texture of a life. He had tried to be present for as much as possible, and he had missed some of it anyway, and the missing had its own weight that he carried with the honesty he brought to everything. Cora had told him once, not accusingly but clearly, that she understood the work was necessary and she did not begrudge it, but that she wanted him to know the cost was real and she needed him to name it rather than minimize it. He had named it. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table and gone through every specific thing he knew he had not been there for and acknowledged it directly, without minimization or excuse. It was one of the harder conversations and one of the more important ones. And now he was coming home. Fully. The last years of the decade, as Millfield moved into the 20th century and the world around it changed with the particular rapid speed of an era turning, were the years Cora looked back on later as the fullest. Clark was there, working now as a consultant to the county, and occasionally to the federal office when a particular case required his specific expertise, but mostly he was there. He was at the supper table. He was at James's graduation from the school in Abilene, where the boy had gone to study law, a choice that Clark received with an expression of uncomplicated pride and Cora received with an expression of no surprise whatsoever. He was there when Ruth, at 15, convinced him to teach her to ride with serious purpose rather than recreational purpose, and he spent those long summer afternoons in the corral with her, and she became a rider of genuine skill, and the relationship between them in those hours, serious, focused, mutually respectful of the other's competence, was one of the great specific joys of Cora's life to observe. He was there for Thomas's slow, wandering passage through childhood into adolescence, for the boy's discovery of books and then of mathematics and then, improbably, of music, and for the long evening conversations that Thomas now sought with his father specifically, having identified Clark as a person who would take an idea seriously and think about it honestly and not reduce it. In the winter of 1902, Cora's rosebush, the one she had grown from her mother's cutting, the one she had planted in the garden of the small cabin on the south edge of town all those years ago, and had carefully transplanted when they moved to the north house, bloomed red in December, which it had never done before. She brought a single bloom inside and put it in a glass on the kitchen windowsill and stood looking at it for a moment. Clark came in from the yard and saw her standing there and came to stand beside her. "Unusual," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him slightly in the way she had leaned against him for 20 years, with the ease of a habit that is also a choice. Outside the kitchen window the garden was mostly winter brown, but the rosebush was red against it, improbable and deliberate. "I have been thinking," Cora said. "About what?" he said. "About how it began," she said. "The whole of it. How small a thing it was, a note at noon and then a knock at the door, and how much came from it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the rose. "I had been watching you for 2 years," he said. "I want you to know that. The note didn't create the impulse. It only finally moved me past the particular form of cowardice I had been maintaining." She looked up at him. "You were afraid of disrupting something that was working," he said. "You had a life here. You were doing well. I was not certain I was something that would improve it." She turned to face him fully. 20 years on his face, the silver at the temples now fully silver, the lines deepened, the eyes unchanged, still that complicated gray of sky before weather decides. "You were the best decision I ever received," she said. He lifted her chin with 2 fingers in the gentle, precise way he had of touching her that had not changed. "Received," he said. "You appeared at my door," she said. "I received you." He smiled, that full, real smile that still changed his face entirely. "I appeared at your door," he agreed. "And you opened it," she had. She had opened it in every possible sense of the word, and what had come through it had filled the space behind her into something she could not have imagined alone. She rose on her toes and kissed him in the warm kitchen, with the winter light coming through the window, and the red rose on the sill, and the sounds of their house around them. Thomas playing something on the second-hand piano they had brought in 2 years ago, Copper moving in the paddock out back where Ruth had been working him, the general organic noise of a life fully inhabited. He held her close and she felt 20 years of this distilled into a single moment. The night of the dance, the porch, the confession, the wedding, the children, the work and the travel and the hard conversations, and the slow building of everything real and lasting that two people build when they choose each other, daily and deliberately, in the long, ordinary miracle of a life together. Outside, Millfield went on about its day. The town that had been 412 people when she arrived was 3,000 now. The land west of town, where her father had invested his quiet hope, was developed into ranches and small farms, holding value just as he had believed it would. The general store she ran was the oldest established business on the main street, and she had just taken on a second employee to help Roy Estelle, who was now 37, and managing the buying side of the business with a thoroughness that made her very glad she had hired him all those years ago. James Dalton was studying law in Abilene and would graduate in the spring, and had plans to return to Millfield, which Clark and Cora had accepted with the specific pleasure of parents who have managed not to require this, and are deeply glad of it anyway. Ruth Dalton was 15 and a person of decided vocation, and was already in correspondence with a woman in San Antonio who ran a breeding operation for working horses, and had agreed to take Ruth on as a student when she came of age, which was going to require Clark to be considerably more sanguine about distance than he currently was, and which Cora intended to help him achieve with the combination of honesty and patience she brought to all difficult truths. Thomas Clark Dalton was 6 years old, and had very recently informed his parents that he intended to be a composer of music, which Clark had received with the expression of a man processing new information carefully, and Cora had received with the expression of a woman who is not even slightly surprised and is entirely in favor. The family was, by any honest accounting, a success, not in the way of grand gestures or public declarations, but in the way that actually counts, in the quotidian, accumulated, irreplaceable way of people who have loved each other truly and built something real. On a warm Saturday morning in the spring of 1903, Cora walked from the house to the store through the main street of Millfield and noticed, not for the first time, the specific quality of the light at this hour in this place. She had noticed it the first morning she arrived, 22 years ago, that quality of the morning light in West Texas that made everything seem like it was still deciding what it wanted to be. She thought now that she understood it differently than she had then. It was not uncertainty in the light, it was possibility. The world in that early morning hour retaining, just for a moment, its full potential before the day claimed it. She had arrived in Millfield uncertain about almost everything and had built, through work and honesty, and the extraordinary gift of one specific man appearing at her door on the right evening, a life that was full in every sense of the word, full of real things, full of real love. The bell above the store door rang as she unlocked it and went in. Roy Estelle arrived 5 minutes later with the delivery from the freight office. The street outside began to fill with the sounds of a town in full morning motion. And somewhere across town, in the county office where he still kept his desk, Clark Dalton was settling into the morning's work with his coffee and his maps and his careful, clear-eyed attention to the world, and he would be home by supper, and the children would be what they were, and the day would unfold in all its specific ordinary particular glory. Everything was resolved. Everything was accounted for. Nothing had been lost that could not, in the long accounting, be understood as the cost of arriving somewhere worth arriving. Cora Thatcher had opened her door in Millfield, Texas, in the August of 1883, when she believed the evening was a lesson in disappointment. She had found, instead, the beginning of everything. She opened the store, and the morning came fully in, and the life that was hers went on with the warm, unhurried certainty of something that is not going anywhere, not because it is standing still, but because it has, at last, arrived where it was always trying to go.